Stream of the Street Chess event that happened here in Canberra yesterday, albeit online rather than face-to-face, as Canberra is in lockdown at least for another 3 weeks. So mid-October is the next date where we're deciding whether to come out of lockdown or not. So in the meantime, Street Chess, which normally runs on Saturday mornings and afternoons in the city, is now currently being run online at the ACTCA Fast Chess Club. And yesterday's tournament attracted a good field of 20 players. I played a couple of games before dropping out just to make sure there were no buys in the tournament. Both my games were pretty tragic, but I did win both of them, more by luck than by skill. The tournament itself was won by Hui Li, candidate master from Macau, who's currently living here in Canberra. And he's been winning a lot of these tournaments of late. And he, as I said, won yesterday's event. In second place was Malik Amir. They tied their individual game, and it was looking like it might be a tie for first, but then Malik managed to lose to Larry Cheng in the last round, allowing Hui Li to come out in first place. In third place, Max Albert, which was a good result for Max on 5 out of 7. The game I am actually featuring is a game involving Larry Cheng and Hui Li, which happened slightly earlier in the tournament, and was quite a good game. Normally, Hui Li would win these games fairly easily, but in this case, Larry Cheng, who was one of our up-and-coming juniors in Canberra, played a really, really good game all the way through until, unfortunately, right at the end when he kind of lost track of what he needed to do. So we'll start with this opening: d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, e3. The Collie system. Now, I'm not a big fan of your Collies and your Londons, to be honest. I think they're a little bit passive. Juniors tend to play them, and lower rated players tend to play them because it's a system rather than an opening. You can generally just plunk your pieces on squares and then wait for the action to erupt. I've seen a few games, however, where the Collie has actually been used as a pretty vicious attacking weapon. c5, a good move in my opinion, because I think the best way to challenge these sort of quiet d4 systems is to try and get as many pawns in the center as possible, or certainly more pawns than your opponent has. So c3 is typical, knight c6, and bishop d3. Now, a couple of engines, when I went over this game, just went, no, this is not a great move. And if you get this position here, the recommendation is to play d takes c5, a5 for black. And the idea is that if you don't play something like a5, b4 might land on the board, and white might be just that annoying person that wins a pawn in the opening and then hangs on for it for as long as possible. In this case, bishop b5 is then recommended. So note the bishop has gone from f1 to b5 rather than to d3 for a couple of reasons. And generally the typical I'm going to try and win the pawn back move of knight e4 just fails miserably in this position. Because after knight e5, you're taking advantage of the pin on the knight. And here are some tactics just to look at. Bishop d7, and we just sack on f7. King takes, and of course queen takes here. And you're attacking both king and the unfortunate knight sitting on e4. So after e6 we just take, and white is winning in this position. So bishop d3 instead. c4 can be played, but it's a move I never like. After bishop c2, the bishop's not really under threat any longer, and you're just lining up against h7. There is a Collie game, if you've ever read Logical Chess Move by Irving Chernev. There is a Collie game in there very early on in the book where white gets a big attack, but I'm pretty sure that bishop g4 didn't get played. Black played an early e6 instead, and the bishop remained locked in. Knight bd2, e6. So we're continuing our development. h3 is not a bad idea. And I mean, as much as I say this isn't a dynamic opening for white, white at least does get a lot of development without too many hassles, doesn't have to make too many difficult choices. And there is a very simple plan in this position for white, and that is to just play e4 and open up the position at some point. So the whole point behind Collie is you prepare an eventual e4. Bishop d6, rook e1 is part of that. You can try and take advantage of bishop d6 by taking on c5 now. Given that the bishop has moved once, you make it move twice, and you make it, in fact, move 3 times. And then the bishop comes back to here. The only drawback with these ideas is what are you going to do about the c pawn? It's now backward. It can't be defended by the b pawn. It is on an open file. And in return for making a couple of pawn moves to chase the bishop away, what do you really get here? Instead, rook e1 fits in with the opening system, and after castles, white plays that important move of e4. Okay, there's a really basic threat of e5 here, forking the knight and the bishop. Okay, so black will take, white recaptures, and now the bishop on d6 is a little bit exposed. So often black takes and white takes. Now, the logical chess move by move game I was referring to earlier, in this case, instead of taking with the bishop, the rook took. Okay, but as I said, it was when the bishop on h5 was probably sitting way back on c8. And in fact, this is a bit of a mistake here. I mean, there are dreams of moving the rook across the board to try and help attack on the king side. But after c takes, here's another bout of just tactics to be aware of. We can play f5, rook takes here, but then we just play bishop takes. And you can play g takes, and white's got a pretty ugly pawn structure here, because if you play queen takes, knight takes d4 forks rook and queen. Queen e3, we just cash in on our material. And black is better in this position. Just up a cold exchange. So we take on e4 with the bishop. Okay. Take on d4. And g4 is the correct move, I think, here. C takes d4 can be played, and let me invite you to another round of tactics here. Right, let's start with some obvious non-tactical move. Rook c8. Black is slightly better, I think, in this position. The rook's taken control of the c-file. Black has actually developed all their pieces. White's still got to bring out the bishop on c1, and consequently the rook on a1, and also isolated d-pawn on d4. So, I'd prefer to be black in that position. Or we can play bishop takes f3 instead. And the idea is we're going to try and look at ways of winning the d-pawn through tactical means. For example, bishop takes f3, knight takes d4, and we've won the pawn, because if you play queen takes d4 here, bishop h2 just simply wins the queen. Okay, but you don't have to take the knight. You take the pawn on b7 instead to keep material equal. So we have 5 pawns each, and after rook b8, black's slightly better, but isn't materially up. Or we can play queen takes f3 here. Okay, and after knight takes d4, queen d3. Okay, now we're threatening the knight, not really. We're threatening the b7 pawn, yes, really. And we're threatening the h7 pawn, yes, really. You can play something like h6 here. Of course, the knight on d4 is still out of bounds because of bishop h2 check, winning the queen like we saw in the earlier line. Nice discovered check there. But we are threatening to play bishop takes b7 here, or able to play bishop takes b7. So you could try those lines for white, okay, but at best, you're still giving black a slight advantage or equality. So g4 is a better move, and after bishop g6, the light square bishops come off, take on d4, take on d4, queen takes d4 here. So white has played this position pretty well. The reason why is I'm going to point out something now is that on the queen side, if you have a look at what pawns are remaining on that side of the board, black has 2 pawns, a7, b7. White has 3 pawns, a2, b2, c3. So 3 against 2. And if you start marching those pawns together and swapping them off, eventually white ends up with a passed pawn on the queen side. On the other hand, black has 4 pawns against 3 on the king side. And you would say, well, we can march those pawns up and create a passed pawn on the king side. 2 issues there. 1, the kings normally start on the king side, so the kings it's quicker to defend. And 2, with the double pawns on g7 and g6, it's often a little bit harder to force a passed pawn, because you can try and get one of your pawns to block 2 of your opponent's pawns because they're sitting on the same file. Okay, so queen takes and the bishop went back, and bishop e3 is another good move. If your opponent's keen to make exchanges, what you try and do is you let them exchange but on your term. So in this case, black is happy to swap queens, and we get our bishop on a strong square, rather than us swapping and letting them get a rook on the d-file. And a6 is a positional mistake, and I'll explain that in a second. I just want to say that rook fd8 was the right move here. Rook ad1, and potentially this game might be a draw, but given that Weili outrated his opponent by about 400 rating points, It's also a question of I'm just going to keep playing until my opponent cracks under the pressure. But a6 is a positional mistake, and we'll see why in a second. The idea behind it, I'm pretty sure, was that black wanted to move the rook from a8 across the board, possibly to c8, but didn't want the bishop on d4 to capture on a7. So moving the pawn up seems to make sense, except for after rook ad1, rook fd8, which is normally the move to challenge the rook on the file. Bishop b6 is a great move, and it really shows that white understood what needs to be done in this position. I'm genuinely surprised that black played a6, by the way, because I just thought that with enough experience, as I said, Wei Li played a couple of Olympiads for Macau and had been the Macau champion, which is not a bad thing. But allowing this kind of idea does surprise me. So the point here is, and this is about the theory of open files, we put our rooks on open files, and the goal is to, if I push the right button, I didn't know it's the wrong button, if the goal is to get your rooks to the 7th so that they can do things like this. Okay? So when we're fighting over open files, the key thing is what we call entry squares. And d7 is an entry square, but it's currently blocked by the opposing rook on d8. But once the bishop went to b6, d8 is out of bounds, and I'll show you what happens if we swap. We swap and we swap, and the rook is going to go to d7. And how do we stop the rook going to d7? Essentially, we can't. So rook goes to b8, for example, just to stop the b7 pawn coming under attack after this move. Say bishop g5, king up, king moves over, and eventually we will win the pawn with a move like bishop to a7. Okay. The reason why the king moved up first, I think, is just to keep an eye on entry squares on rook d1 check if the rook then heads across to d8. So, and this just wins a pawn here. And this is a perfect example of moving the rook to the open file, moving the rook to the 7th rank, and then cleaning up on some pawns. The black played rook dc8, which wasn't quite the right move. Rook db8, which is ugly as, but is at least the only move that works here, because essentially you're protecting the a7 square with the other rook, even though it's jammed in the corner. So after rook here, king f8, you're not quite threatening to win too much, but even after this position here, black is in serious trouble. So we play bishop f6, there could have been other moves, and then you get bishop c7 in, attacking the rook, and the rook moves out of the way, and you just simply play the check here. And after the king moves across, you just take here. And again, white has won a pawn. And in fact, just about in all these lines here, from this position onwards, white is, funnily enough, just going to win a pawn. It's going to be the b7 pawn, and it just shows you how important it is getting your rooks to the 7th rank. Rook d7, bishop to c5, and I think that was the reason why the rook went to c8, to at least swap these pieces off. Takes, and then we just take here. Okay, and white is now up a pawn. Doesn't even need to now swap pawns off to force a passed pawn on the queen side, because this pawn can run. So rook went to d5, kind of a sensible idea, because you want to get your rooks onto open files and try the same trick yourself of getting the rook to the 7th rank, or down in this case, down to d2. You can't use the other rook initially because your main worry is you might end up losing the a pawn for nothing. So king across to the center. Now it turns out that about now white had built up a winning position, but started to falter a little bit, because I suspect one of the reasons why white started to falter is that they haven't reached this position too often, and therefore knowing what to do here can be a little bit tricky. Good advice is try and be as active as possible with your rook. So rook e4, you don't have to worry about losing the pawn on b2 because it's happily guarded at the moment. And then rook c4, and the idea is you're going to play rook to c7, and then you're going to have not one but two rooks trying to carve across the board. Essentially, in double rook endings like this, double rooks on the 7th is the goal, but you can run into trouble when both of you do it, and it kind of becomes a bit of a draw because both sides just start cleaning up on the 7th rank and checking the king, and no one really gets away. But I think in this case, white is just much, much better. I think the best that black is ever going to do in this position is end up with a rook on f8 to protect the f7 pawn, and if that's the case, then the pawn on a6 is probably going to go at some point. King f1, not bad, and I can see the logic behind it. Basically, white is worried that the black rook will get to d2 and try and win those pawns. So wants to bring the king across to help defend. So rook a d8 and, of course, rook e2 here. But again, too passive, too passive, too passive. Probably needed to be a little bit more active by going to e4. And in this case, then even threatening to go across to a4. a5, king g2 suddenly is the right-ish idea. c4 could have been played, forcing the rook off the file, and then you just play b3. And the advantage for white is based on the fact that the white rooks can be more active than the black rooks, because the black rook on the c file kind of only has 2 squares to go to, 3 squares. The one it's on, c6, c8. g5. Now, g5 was a funny move because it had been mentioned earlier on by when I was analysing this game by Stockfish, but it just didn't seem to make sense to me in terms of what was trying to be achieved. So I didn't mention it then, but I am mentioning it now. It turns out to be an important move for reasons which I'm still scratching my head, but it does turn out to be an important move. King f3, we play g6. Okay. King e4. Now, white is somewhat getting carried away here. I'm not sure what the logic behind marching the king up the board at this point. Really, I think the goal should have been get your rooks behind your passed pawns, try and start pushing on the queen side, and then tie black's rooks down to defending there. Then think about doing something with your king. So rook to d6, and a4 again is not a great move as well. You want to push, what they're saying is you push the candidate passed pawn first. Okay, so maybe c4 followed by b3. Rook d3, and suddenly the king is in a bit of a mating net. Now, I don't think white realised this until far too late, but the king is suddenly surrounded by the opponent's pawns and rooks, and it is possible to get checkmated in the ending. So rook e3 to protect the h3 pawn, and then rook d2. If you're going to checkmate your opponent, you want as many pieces on the board, I think, in this case. Swapping rooks would have just helped white completely. White would have probably easily won if the rooks had come off. So black, despite getting a worse position, is doing their best to keep the game going. King goes back, smart move. Rook d5, okay, protecting the a pawn just in case there were dreams of trying to win it. Okay. The king should have kept going back to here just to get the king out of danger. Instead, white now started the plan that they should have done earlier. And it's one of these tragedies of chess, I think, is that often we can sometimes choose the right plan, but we choose it at the wrong time. White needed to do this earlier and didn't. And by the time white decided to do this, it suddenly was a little bit worse. Takes and takes. Oh, and we're threatening to win the pawn here. Now, this is white's last chance to keep the win. Okay. Needed to play king g2. Okay. At first you go, why? Can I play rook f4 here? But if you play rook f4, rook f3 is the right move. Because funnily enough, if the rook now moves out of the way, the f7 pawn falls. When we play rook a2 to get behind one of the pawns, you just play a5. And when the king starts to move across, simply just swap rooks. You get this position here, and black is in a little bit of trouble / a lot of trouble. Basically, the 2 queenside pawns are going to come down the board with the required protection and preparation of the white rook and easily win the game. There's nothing much black really can do. And the other problem is if you try and start marching the king across the board, then the f7 pawn falls. If you move the rook behind the b pawn, the a pawn is going to start marching up the board. Okay. If you don't move it behind the b pawn, okay, at their leisure, white is just going to start protecting their own pawns with something like h4, and then look at bringing the king up the board. So instead, a5 was played, and this gave black the important tempo, initially to reach a drawn position. Rook f4 check, king g3, rook takes f2. Okay? And now you can kind of see the importance of the g5 move, because h4 and f4 are now out of bounds for the king. And after b5, the position is drawn. We just play rook check, king f3, rook check, and if we play king g3, black has nothing better than just to repeat the position. Black might have played on for a few more moves because obviously it's very frustrating when you're drawing with someone rated below you and you need a win, for example, to keep your tournament going. But that would have been the draw, except white missed the mating net. White moved the king up here, thinking, great, I've avoided the perpetual, and now I'm going to win this game, not realising that, sadly, rook f4 check, only move is king here, and we've just walked into a checkmate. So, a couple of lessons from that game. 1, no matter how well you play all the way through the game, If you blunder at the end, it's all not for naught, because it's a great learning experience to play this well as white, but result-wise, it's still the same as if you blundered on move 3. So you've got to keep your attention going. 2, sometimes you've got to spot the danger signs and just go, okay, I've mucked this up slightly. I'm happy with a draw. I'm just going to take the draw. But finally, the real lesson from this game, which I thought was great, was essentially this move here. Bishop to b6. Okay, finding this move was a great move for white, and it really shows the importance of rooks on the open file being supported by other pieces. You just can't go, I'll put my rooks on open files, my opponent will put their rooks on open files, we'll swap everything off and it'll be a boring draw. In this case, because you can control some of the entry squares on the file, it turns out to be actually a great move for white in this case. So a win for the tournament winner, Hui Li. Should have been a win for Larry Cheng, who at least redeemed himself by beating the player that came second, which was Malak Amir in the last round. That was an interesting game, but I thought this was much more instructive. And this game came from yesterday's Street Chess. We run these on Saturdays from 11 a.m. Canberra time. If you're a local Canberra player, feel free to try and sign up to the ACTCA Fast Chess Club, noting that you need to put your real name in your application. So many people try and sign up and just say, hey, I want to join your club, which I think is the standard script from Lichess. Say, I am Joe Bloggs, I play at the ANU Chess Club or whatever, can I please join? Yep, I'll just tick the box, no dramas there. But if you just say, I wish to join your chess club, no, you're not going to join under those circumstances. So my name's Sean Press. I run Street Chess, both in real life and online. We run the tournaments every Saturday from 11 a.m, 7-round event, 15 minutes per player per game. Been running in Canberra for 30 years now. And hopefully when we get out of lockdown, we'll be back at King O'Malley's, bigger and better than ever, back to our sort of 35 to 40 player tournaments that we've been running for the last few months. So thanks for tuning in. I do these summaries after every online event. So hopefully, if I don't forget, I'll be doing one on Tuesday morning after the ACTCA Monday Night Blitz. But until then, thanks for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you later.